Get over here.
Good morning, everyone. And thank you for coming out today. We're kind of getting our technology in place because we know we're going to go live, right? Just waiting for our commentator over here. Okay. So my name is Valerie Eaton, and I am the president of the Peekskill NAACP. So welcome to our event where we are going to have a panel discussion. No pros and cons. Just going to give you some information about what it means to legalize marijuana. Okay? We all need to be in the know. So, before I begin, the first thing we always do is we pray in. So, we know we all have different religions and different spirituality. So, just bring your positive energy as we pray the Holy Spirit into this place. So, we thank you, Father God, for another day. We thank you for allowing all of our community to come together in one place, on one accord, just to learn more about what is going on in our world. So we ask you, Father God, to continue to permeate the atmosphere. Let us be on one accord, and let us be able to listen, hear, and also speak. So we ask all this in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen. Also, another thing that we do is we read our mission statement, because we want you to know what the NAACP stands for. So I'm going to read it because you all don't have it in front of you. Usually it's a unison thing. So I'm going to read it out loud to you. The mission of the NAACP is to ensure the political, social, educational, and economic equality of rights for all, and to eliminate race-based discrimination. So that's what we're about. And now we're going to introduce our facilitator, who is Vanessa Agudelo, and she's going to introduce our panelists. So thank you once again for coming, and we look forward to having a good discussion. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you all so much for being here. My name is Vanessa Agudelo, and I'm just going to settle in here. And I'm the chair of the Environmental Climate Justice Committee for the NAACP. If you are interested at all in joining our committee, you do not need to be an NAACP member, though we prefer you to be a member. And we actually, putting in a plug for Valerie, we are giving out free t-shirts for anyone who wants to join the NAACP today. So please feel free to do so before you leave. But if you are interested in joining the ECJ committee, as we call it, when you sign in, you can just check off your name, make sure you have an email or phone number there, and we'll make sure we get you notified when our next meeting is. And just if anyone wants to put in their calendar now, it's the first Thursday of the month, 6:30 p.m., and we meet at the Paul Robeson Gallery. So thank you all so much for being here to talk about this incredibly important issue. Marijuana legalization is actually probably the top state issue for the NAACP right now. It's something that we have been hearing a lot about the last few months, the last year and a half. It's something that, as most of us know, our governor campaigned heavily on last year when he was really pushing to have this legalized by the end of session. So we've been hearing from a lot of sides, especially here in the Hudson Valley and in Westchester, as to whether we should be legalizing marijuana or not. Here at the NAACP, we take a stance that we believe that marijuana should be absolutely legalized, with the caveat that the funding sources that are generated, the tax revenue that's generated, go to communities that were most affected by the war on drugs, so communities of color, Peekskill being one of them. So that's why I felt as though this conversation was so important to have here. And most of you know, I'm a council member here in the city of Peekskill, and it is a topic that I feel affects us very much so. In fact, the reason why I for one, am a big advocate for marijuana legalization is because I've seen at a very young age how growing up here in Peekskill, I've seen my friends be introduced to the criminal justice system just because they had a bag of weed on them. And I've seen how friends who I have that smoke pot that are white, and friends who I have who are people of color that also smoke pot, I've seen how that introduction into the criminal justice system has completely affected their lives and trajectory moving forward. And that's something that we really need to talk about. And I mean, I can give you kind of anecdotal stories about scenarios and situations that myself and friends of mine have been in here in Peekskill. For example, I've had a friend who was walking down the street and because he was black, he was stopped by a cop, and this was about 5 years ago. And the cop pretty much accused him of selling pot. This was an ex-boyfriend of mine who I know was not selling pot. When they didn't find any marijuana on him, they ran his license and they saw that he had not shown up for a traffic ticket violation. They arrested him. He wasn't able to pay bond, so he ended up sending him to jail. All because they thought he had marijuana on him because he was black. And then because he wasn't able to show up for the traffic violation, right? And although that is something that people, not that I'm advocating for folks not to show up for court at all, I just don't think that that's a good enough reason to be in jail. And I think that that is definitely part of the conversation. So enough about me. I do want to introduce our wonderful panelists. I want to say a big thank you to the NAACP, a big thank you to the Drug Policy Alliance, who we have, who's supported us with our refreshments. There is a number of materials in the front if you want to learn more about the Marijuana Regulation and Taxation Act that we're pushing. And now I will allow the panelists to introduce themselves. I will give everyone about 5 minutes to do their intros, talk a little bit about themselves, what has brought them to this work, and also if you could just answer. Oh yes, and there are index cards in the back. Our president of the NAACP, we have our own questions, but we will also have a section during the program where we will be taking questions from the audience. So index cards will be passed out. If you have any questions, feel free to jot them down. Valerie will pick them up, and then we'll make sure that they get answered at the end. So to start, please tell us a little bit about yourself and what brings you to marijuana regulation. What does the status quo of marijuana decriminalization look like in your work and communities?
Good morning. My name is Damon Jones. I am the publisher of Black Westchester Magazine and co-host of People Before Politics radio show, and I'm also the New York representative of Blacks in Law Enforcement of America. That is a national organization of Black law enforcement professionals. I worked at I am still working at Westchester County Department of Corrections for 28 years. What brings me here is from a law enforcement professional perspective, and I've been in law enforcement organizations since 1990, since I started the job, and community-based law enforcement organizations. And National Black Police Association, I was a part of that, and they're one of the oldest African American law enforcement professional organizations, and they always have the stance that marijuana should be legal within communities and within states in America because of the arrest. Just like here in Westchester, when you make up 14% of the population, people are black or brown, but yet we're over 50% of the rest. And there's also studies that our white counterparts, smoke more weed and use more drugs than we do. But our communities are the communities that are over-policed. So to have this conversation and to talk about what the New York State legislation should look like and how it would reflect on communities of color and poor communities is good, because the people that make the law, they are elected by us. They're elected by the people. So the legislation that they create should reflect on the concerns of the people. So I think having more forums to educate the people and to have these discussions and to have our voice heard in the legislation that will ultimately hit the governor's desk. We just don't want them to talk about it. We want them to be about it. And we want that legislation to even have some type of reparations for those who have been affected by being arrested with small amounts of marijuana, and their lives have been changed because of that arrest. Now it's going to be legal. It's going to be $1 million business. So how does that look to our communities, and how does that money come back into those communities that have been affected. So, and that's why I'm here. Thank you.
Hi, good morning. Let me see if I can get heard. I raised 2 kids. I figured I should be able to be heard over, make myself pretty well heard. Good morning, everybody. Thank you all for coming. My name is Steve Rabinowitz. I'm the Vice President of an organization called Families for Sensible Drug Policy. And we're a global network that advocates for harm reduction and non-punitive approaches to use to substance use. The organization was founded by moms who actually had lost children to overdoses and who felt that the punitive approach was not what was actually hurt their children, didn't help them. But let me tell you a little about myself. I worked for 32 years in the addiction services field. 30 of those I was with the New York State Office of Alcoholism and Substance Abuse Services. And started back in 1986. I was a homeless outreach worker at the time of the height of the crack cocaine epidemic and the rise of the HIV/AIDS epidemic. So I've seen a few things. A couple of years of doing that sort of work, I wound up in the funding and program oversight area. And I wound up spending the last 12 years of my career in the state as the director of downstate field operations, where I oversaw funding and program services for New York City and Long Island. And in 2016, I retired and became an addiction services consultant. So what really brought me here is that I have a very deep commitment to serving people affected by substance use disorders and prevention, treatment, and recovery. Based on what I've seen and my experience over my years working in the field, I came to the firm conclusion that the so-called war on drugs and drug prohibition has not only failed to address the problem of substance use, but in many respects it's made it worse. Let me address some arguments that you hear nowadays against the current bill and against the idea of a regulated marijuana trade. You know, you hear the classical gateway drug argument that making marijuana use legal will somehow cause young people to develop problems and go on to worse forms of substance use. Well, first of all, talk to any young person today and ask them how, if they wanted marijuana, would they know where to get it, how difficult would it be? And the answer will be, yeah, I can get it, and no, it wouldn't be very difficult at all. And we all know, any of us who have raised children know that. I used to ask my children. And also, you know, nobody who's advocating for this bill, at least that I know of, wants to have young people under 21 have access to marijuana. We feel that having a regulated trade actually makes it easier to prevent that. For most kids these days, we were talking earlier, they'll tell you that they can get weed a lot easier than they get legal alcohol. But you know, there's a big mythology out there that somehow marijuana by itself leads to harder or more problematic substance use. But you know what, prevention science and research, and I've studied this quite a bit, have clearly shown that the use, particularly the regular use of any psychoactive substance by young teens or preteens, that includes alcohol and tobacco. And in fact, we've done some recent studies that show that young people who regularly use energy drinks and caffeinated beverages have a propensity to go on to substance use later. And that has a lot to do with, I think in many cases, that first of all, they get used to the idea of using a mood-altering substance, and secondly, that many of our young people who've experienced trauma or experiencing depression or anxiety are really going undiagnosed, and they're turning to whatever psychoactive substance they can get their hands on to help them cope with that. And those are the young people who are at risk later for developing substance use problems. As a very wise man named Dr. Gabor Mate put it, don't look at the addiction, look at the pain. And when we deal with substance abuse, we have to go beyond looking at the substance itself, but the pain that it causes. What the opponents don't speak about is that cannabis has served as an exit strategy for a lot of people with opioid use disorders and who are dependent on opioids for chronic pain and other conditions. And there's a lot of recent research in Israel that bears this out. The data shows that, in fact, when people have access to cannabis, they're much less likely to die of opioid overdose death and injuries. And that any form of, as we believe, every form of harm reduction is a good thing because people who are dead can't recover. The risks associated with marijuana use? Yeah, of course there are. But there's a risk with the use of any drug or something. Look at those TV ads for prescription drugs that tell you, don't use this drug if you do this or that, or if you're allergic to Eliquis, I'll name one, don't use Eliquis. You know, yeah, if you're allergic to peanuts, don't eat peanuts. Look, there are clearly some people who would be well off to avoid cannabis use. If you've had a history of psychotic disorders in yourself or in your family members, it's a risk, it's a risk. But the thing is that prohibition hasn't stopped people from engaging in risky behavior. And the fact that cannabis use in a regulated environment where there are quality controls and without contaminants is a lot less. You know, keep in mind that in the year 2018, no one died of a cannabis overdose, because no one's ever died of a cannabis overdose as far as anyone knows. But 4 people died from eating romaine lettuce. Which one's more risky? What a regulated marijuana trade will give us, in my view, is an environment where we can have an honest and frank discussion and have public education around marijuana use, and where adults can make informed decisions for themselves as to whether or not to indulge. And the notion that that'll lead to large numbers of people who've not been using cannabis in the past to drop everything and go out and get high is pretty ludicrous. We have this conversation about things like, there's a whole debate about supervised injection facilities, you know, where we reduce risk of people from dying of opioid overdoses. You know, someone said, well, if someone opened a supervised injection facility in your community tomorrow, would you go out and buy a bag of heroin and shoot up? I don't think most of us would. You know, the opponents like to tell stories about Colorado and how bad things are there. You know, I guess maybe I have something against John Denver or something like that. But I was out in Colorado. I worked as a federal consultant for the state, where I was actually working with them on implementing medication-assisted treatment for opioid disorders and engaging peer services. By the way, that initiative was funded by tax revenue for marijuana sales. I talked to the people from the state drug authority there, and they all told me they didn't see big issues with it. Yes, some problems with parents who are a little loose about leaving their paraphernalia out where their kids can see it. You know, same problem with parents who leave their open liquor bottles out for kids. Unfortunately, you can't make laws against bad parenting. Same thing, I had conversations with the former mayor of Northampton, Massachusetts, who told me that when marijuana legalization came, you know, was pretty unremarkable, except for the fact there are a lot of New Yorkers driving over to Massachusetts to buy marijuana. Well, that's because we don't have a legal, regulated trade yet. So I think there's a lot of cases to be made for having a regulated marijuana trade. You hear a lot of discussion about the impact of quote-unquote big marijuana. I think that's a red herring in a lot of respects. The current bill actually has a lot of incentives for small business, and particularly businesses in communities of color that, as Damon pointed out rightly, were the most damaged by the current prohibition laws, to engage in the marijuana trade, and that's certainly something we would like to see. So I'd like to, you know, turn this over to the rest of our panelists, and we'll hear more, and look forward to having a very active and engaged discussion on this issue. Thanks very much.
Hi, my background is I'm a former legal aid attorney representing children in family court, defending juvenile delinquents, and representing abused and neglected children, and something called PIMS petitions, which are children that are having problems in the home, acting out, that sort of thing. And it was in this job that I first saw the lunacy of our system and was made aware of this war on drugs and how ineffective it was and how backward our system is. And that we are spending the money on resources, instead of spending the money on resources for helping children and families, we're spending the money on the back end for courts and judges and lawyers and officers and that sort of thing. I mean, put the money at the front end and prevent trauma. And I've seen this over and over again throughout my years, as I haven't been a practicing attorney in quite some time, but I have remained in a position to be working with children in a combination of roles, including being on the school board in Rockford Manor, being on the school board at Saybrook 11, which is a special act district that teaches the children who reside in Children's Village, who are children that come from all over the state with some of the most challenging issues facing them, and so we teach them. And also being on a board for an agency called April's Child, which was a group that prevented child abuse and neglect through a home visitation parent-mentor model. And we were the only agency in Westchester that serviced families before a referral to DSS. And we had no barriers to access, yet we couldn't sustain our funding, and we had to close. And so it's through, and I'm also, I want to include that I'm a parent of 3 girls, one of whom is a foster child. So in all of these roles, again, I have seen over and over again how this war on drugs doesn't work, that we have to be realistic, that marijuana is out there, that people use it, that prohibition does not curb use, and it never has, it never will. We don't know what happened with alcohol. So it's time to regulate it and legalize it, regulate it, and use those resources at the beginning of children's lives to prevent the trauma and help them at the beginning to start off on a good front. So we don't have to waste the resources on the other side, which brings me to 3 other minor issues I want to touch on. One is that, we should all remember the origin of these laws were not about public safety. The origin of these laws were about discrimination. We have from the famous Nixon tapes, we can hear them talking about trying to get the hippies and the black people. And that's where the war on drugs comes from. And I can recommend 2 wonderful movies, one of which is now on HBO, The Grass is Always Greener, which is not on Netflix, I'm sorry, and The House I Live In, which lay out the case beautifully for where these laws came from and why they're on the books. It had nothing to do with public safety, which is what they're all trying to, which the opposition is saying now. We have to protect our youth. Well, I say that to protect our youth, we need to regulate, which will allow us to have reality-based conversations with our youth that acknowledge that there is use. And we have the Drug Policy Alliance has created a safety first curriculum, which has, again, reality-based conversations with our youth that talk about the things like the effect on the growing brain, that you should delay use, and all that kind of thing. And we would have a safer product. We would be able to restrict access to minors. Let's see. And finally, that another major argument I think we're going to talk more about is that people say, oh, well, just decriminalize it. I don't care, but decriminalization is not enough. We need to legalize decrim. You still have arrests, you still have all the collateral damage from arrests, and you still have and the disproportionate number of people who are arrested. So that's my general take on the issue. Lots more information to come, but I'll pass it on to my colleague.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Saad Siddiqui. I'm an attorney. I've been practicing for over 10 years. Spent 6.5 years at the Legal Aid Society of Westchester County. And so, everyone hear me now? Yeah, okay. Yeah, this one's not working. Okay. Now it is. So I spent 6.5 years at the Legal Aid Society and about 4 years of private practice. In that time, I've handled a few thousand cases in the criminal courts in Westchester County, particularly in southern Westchester, Yonkers, Mount Vernon, where there are heavily saturated density communities of color. And so, in addition, I am the chair, of the Criminal Justice Section of the County Bar Association, as well as Board of Directors of the Youth Shelter Organization of Westchester and a Board of Directors of the Lower Hudson Valley chapter of the Civil Liberties Union. So I've had a lot of dealings on this issue. So I'll just throw out a couple of facts that I think are very relevant to this conversation. 1977, New York State decriminalized marijuana. So that meant that if someone is arrested with a small quantity of marijuana, it is not a criminal offense, it is a violation, which is the functional equivalent of a ticket, an infraction. Well, since 1977, and this was actually taken from an editorial in the New York Times, between 1977 and 2010, so we're talking about 33 years, there were 525,000 arrests for unlawful possession of marijuana, a non-crime. Here are the statistics. 80% of those people arrested were African American and Hispanic. Over 80%, less than 20% were white. That is in New York City. Now, in January of this year, the District Attorney for Westchester County, Anthony Scarpino, announced a change in the policy for prosecutions in marijuana, indicating that they will not prosecute low-level offenses. And I believe that announcement was made on January 14th of this year. Nonetheless, arrests for low-level offenses have persisted. So this is from the May 31st, 2019 edition of the Journal News. They did just a review on this. Since the change in the policy, there have been approximately over 160 arrests for low-level marijuana offenses. So we're talking about unlawful possession of marijuana, still a non-crime. Here's the breakdown according to our Journal News. 89% of the people arrested were African American, 49% of them were Hispanic, and 19 were white. And that is, the irony is, these are cases that the District Attorney's Office will not prosecute, but you had municipal law enforcement agencies still deciding to go forward with arresting these individuals. Now, talking about, and again, this is still under the banner of decriminalization. So you get arrested for something that isn't a crime, that in theory you could get up to 15 days in jail for, but still not a crime on the books. You're looking at upwards of a $250 fine, up to $125 surcharge. Still not a crime on the books. But here's what you face if you wind up pleading guilty to that. If you are 17 or 18 years old, very tempting. Hey, let me just plead guilty to this ticket. It's not a crime. Well, if you're thinking about going to college, you are now disqualified from getting any federal subsidized student loan. That's number one. Number two, you are also going to have a problem getting into any federal subsidized housing program. And number three, if you are not a United States citizen, good luck trying to become a United States citizen. And this is for something that is actually not a crime. And in my capacity as a defense attorney, that's an issue that has come up several times. And I'll give you something that actually is very counterintuitive, but it really describes part of the problem with decriminalization and why it in many ways hasn't worked. Representing someone with no prior criminal history who's been charged with a misdemeanor, which is an actual crime, and a unlawful possession of marijuana. Now, obviously, for the purposes of a criminal record, it's better to plead guilty to something that isn't a crime, you would think. And ironically, from immigration's perspective, absolutely not. This person was actually in a better position pleading guilty to a misdemeanor, which is an actual crime, than that marijuana non-crime from the perspective of an immigration court. Now, granted, this is also a reflection as to the problems with our current immigration system, but that's a conversation for another time. But it really shows you that decriminalization has not worked. Both when you look at the statistics, the disproportionate impact, the collateral consequences. So that is actually what has brought me to this work. And I'm just going to preface this. Should marijuana become legalized, trust me, I am not a person who's going to be lighting up a doobie to celebrate. That is not me. It's not something that I will necessarily encourage my children to do either. I'm the father of two small children, a 6-month-old and a 3.5-year-old. That being said, looking at the current state of our law, it does not work. And it has led to, just even anecdotally from a personal perspective, I have watched communities of color get ravaged by the way these cases are prosecuted. Because having handled cases in Mount Vernon and how those cases are handled versus cases in northern Westchester, someone said Chappaqua, absolutely. From my own personal experience, there is absolutely a truth in that. And that is why the law needs to change. because as a practical matter, it's not applied evenly. And anyone who doesn't believe that, since they have stopped prosecuting low-level offenses, 19 white people were arrested versus 89 African Americans versus 49 Hispanic. And this is for cases that the district attorney's office will not prosecute. So, having said that, that is how I got involved. I now turn it over to my fellow panelists. Nelson.
Hi everybody, thank you so much for coming out to have this discussion with us. My name is Nelson Guerrero. I'm the Executive Director and Co-Founder of the Cannabis Cultural Association, a 501c3 nonprofit based in New York City with a big focus here in the tri-states of New York, New Jersey, Connecticut. My organization's main goal is to really help destigmatize cannabis. We promote access for both medical, adult use regulations, but the reason we started was to really get more people of color involved in this industry. In 2015, I attended my first industry event with my co-founder. He was the only African American in the room, I was the only Latino in the room, so we immediately became friends and realized and started asking how do we get more people that look like us in the industry? Because like Damon pointed before, right now as far as the industry looks, the legal industry in the states that are regulated, it's unfortunately 99% white Caucasian has ownership, and then the few POCs only have about 1% to 2% ownership in this current industry. Yet, as far as the prison system goes, we make up the majority of arrests, everyone is notated today, but we don't make up the legal industry. So it's something we really need to change. It's something we focused on. So our organization really focuses on social justice reform, making sure whatever bill gets passed here in the Northeast is equity focused. Because like we know, whatever New York does, the rest of the world seems to follow. That's why it's extremely important that when we talk about regulation here in New York State, that we do it the right way. And I'm born and raised in Westchester County, born in Mount Kisco, raised in northern Westchester and Somers, one of the very few Latinos up there. My very fond memories here at Peekskill, getting my first driver's permit here, and then also getting the worst whooping in basketball I've ever had in my career at Peekskill High School. We lost by like 30 points, it was ridiculous. But what got me involved in the cannabis space was my grandfather, my abuelo. He has prostate cancer. In 2001, he was diagnosed, had his prostate removed, and went into remission for about 15 years. In 2015, however, his cancer came back pretty aggressively, stage 4, metastasized in his chest. Doctors recommended oral chemo, as well as traditional chemo. My grandfather, seeing his close friends go through the same process and not doing very well, decided against that and went with the traditional, just oral chemo. Did not do very well. Within his first 6 months, lost about 12 pounds, was doing very, very bad. He wasn't my grandfather anymore, didn't have a lot of energy. At that point, I had to have the hardest conversation of my life with extremely Catholic, conservative, Latino parents. So you tell them, hey, let's try cannabis tinctures for a little, maybe that'll help ease the side effects. Fast forward a couple of years later, my grandfather is now a medical marijuana patient here in New York. Cannabis tinctures have bought him an extra 2.5 years of life so far, and God willing, I'll have many more. And it was because of cannabis tinctures, he's still with us today. And it's that message that I've been trying to share, and it's got me involved in this after going to many industry events. And it's extremely important that the community gets behind this, not just for medical purposes, because it's about access, but also for adult use, because like everyone here has already mentioned, the criminal justice system is broken, and it's not reflective of what it should be. And after my grandfather's success with cannabis, we've done a lot of great work. We've done a lot of federal lobbying, local lobbying at the state level, and I'm grateful that in my home county here we're having this conversation, and I don't want us to turn into what Nassau County did and preemptively opt out. I know northern Westchester, Somers, like where I was raised, tax revenue, they have really nice schools, we have really nice roads. But areas like Peekskill, down south, Yonkers, these communities can extremely benefit from the tax revenue that this industry will bring. And, what I like to talk about when it comes to the cannabis industry, it's about equity, it's about opportunities. So it's about having jobs, having ownership, making sure that when cannabis comes to the state, that it's not just big cannabis where we have these the MedMens of the world having dispensaries on Fifth Avenue and stuff, but it's also about local ownership. So folks have an opportunity to have ownership. And if big cannabis is coming, because we all know it is, but there is some corporate social responsibility, and that's what's extremely important. Make sure that jobs are being offered, there is the investment in the community, and that's law enforcement obviously deserves a chunk of the tax revenue will come in, but schools, hospitals, or roads, they need it as well. And that's what is extremely important. And I'm really here today to talk to you about a lot of things that I've seen, the work that I've done. I've been to Colorado, I've been to all these other legal states, and what I can definitely say is even if you don't want to work in the cannabis space, if you're a local business that's near a dispensary, you're going to benefit greatly. I always talk about Doña Rosa on Stout Street in Denver. It's literally next door to the Stout Street dispensary. She's an 80-year-old Mexican woman whose business has tripled since her taco business has tripled since being next to the dispensary. Has no idea about what cannabis is, but she says we're the most lovely people and they buy all the tacos. So she can't complain. And that's what the reality is when this industry does come here. But whatever way that we do roll it out here in New York, it has to be equitable, it has to be diverse, it has to be inclusive. And we need to allow those folks that are currently incarcerated throughout our state to have the opportunity to get their lives back. Whether they want to work in this industry or not, they have that right to continue their lives that we have unjustly taken away from them. And lastly, my organization is one of the currently 5 plaintiffs suing the federal government, the DOJ, and the DEA for the unconstitutionality of cannabis. We just got our opinion piece back, and fortunately our case hasn't been dismissed, but the Second Circuit is asking us to appeal to the DEA again. Hasn't worked previously, but we're going to keep fighting the good fight. And after this, if you guys check us out, cannacultural.org. You'll see our new Can Abuelo video, which is bilingual, to help educate a little bit about medical access. Thank you.
Thank you all. So I am passing around, for those of you who came late, I'm passing around index cards for you to write your questions on for the panelists. Please try to keep it to factual questions that you have. This is not a pros and cons debate, so we just want to make sure that we get the facts and what legalization really does mean. So I do have index cards. If I gave you one and you already have your question, please give it back to me, and Vanessa will be happy to read it. Thank you.
Thank you, Valerie, and thank you so much. As you can see, we really have a diverse group of people here having this discussion with various amounts of expertise and perspectives and experiences, so we're very grateful to have them all here. This was something that Mr. Siddiqui spoke or touched on earlier, but I did want to offer this question up as the first question for the general group. Where can regulation succeed where decriminalization has failed? I think one of the things we hear a lot from our state electeds, both in the Senate and the Assembly, who understand the racial justice and the criminal justice reform piece of this, they always say, well, why don't we just decriminalize it? And as Mr. Siddiqui pointed out, this has been decriminalized since 1977. So I do want to offer up that question as a start. Where can regulation succeed where decriminalization has failed? Feel free to pick up.
Oh, we're going this way?
Whoever wants to start.
I think.
No, yes.
Yeah. I work in the jail. I talk loud, so I don't.
We just want to make sure we get you on video for the folks.
No.
Oh, okay. Oh, okay. All right.
No, you.
All right. I'm good. Yeah. See, he's sounding good. All right. But I think we can put whatever we want in the legislation. I mean, this is what the legislation should reflect what the people demand, and I think we definitely have to have some type of reparations for those who have been incarcerated and arrested for low-level amounts of marijuana. I think that would be crucial where decriminalization has failed, right? And listening to the numbers of arrests, and I think I'm appalled. I don't believe law enforcement should get any of the money because law enforcement has used small amounts of marijuana as a tool of oppression to black and brown communities because it's a byproduct of racial profiling. So I don't believe that law enforcement should get any of the tax dollars. They get enough they get enough of our tax dollars, and they get enough tax dollars of the communities that they oppress. But I do think that the legislation should talk about or should direct some type of reparations for those who have been arrested for small amounts of marijuana in the past. I don't think you got it.
You're fine too.
I'll second what Damon had to say, particularly around the area of expungement. We need laws that will expunge the criminal records of anybody who's been damaged by these laws. None of the decriminalization proposals I've seen actually address that issue. And again, that's the issue that's really so dramatically hurt people of color, people, folks in general, but particularly communities of color, about all the issues that Saad brought up earlier about, being denied access to federal programs, immigration issues, and employment discrimination, and so forth. But one of the issues also that this decriminalization doesn't address is the issue of trafficking. And in fact, in Portugal, which decriminalized every substance, including heroin, personal possession of those drugs in 2001, and by the way, Portugal hasn't fallen apart. Still going pretty well, lots of tourists coming in, everything's pretty much good there, except they still have problems with trafficking, because that's what decriminalization doesn't address. And the fact is, even if you make personal possession legal, people are going to get that drug from somewhere. One of the things, for instance, when the reporters were going down to Sinaloa, Mexico, where El Chapo was from when they were covering the trial, one of the things they saw recently was that marijuana was sitting unharvested and rotting in the fields. Why? Because there's so much legal marijuana now in the West, because most of the Western states have legalized it, that there's no longer a market for marijuana being trafficked from Mexico. So that, in fact, by having a regulated trade, we pretty much, and you won't eliminate it entirely. Look, we ended alcohol prohibition in 1933, and there's still moonshiners and bootleggers, and you've seen that show Moonshine Wars on whatever channel it's on. So folks up in the hills doing what, with their little copper kettles and such, and that's always going to go on. There's a legal trade in, untaxed cigarettes. I know that because my dad was an attorney and used to defend some guys who were involved in that trade. So you're always going to have a certain amount of that, but the fact is, the kind of violence and damage that's done by having a large-scale illegal trade marijuana goes away if we have a regulated trade. So I think that's a very important piece that decriminalization doesn't capture.
Lisa, if you could pick that up or move it closer to you.
I think that people should be aware that this bill was not just introduced. Senator Kruger introduced this a couple of years ago, and Assembly Person People Stokes joined the bill. She's the the Assembly person who's sponsoring the bill. And it was reintroduced 2 years ago. There's been a tremendous amount of work that has gone into creating a careful, just law that addresses the equity concerns and addresses some of the issues that have arisen in the states where it's already been legal. We do have the benefit of not being the first and learning some mistakes. For example, in California, they taxed it so high that the illicit market was still thriving because it was so much cheaper. So we're finding the right tax point in New York. The other thing that just even a couple of weeks ago, when the bill didn't pass during the budget season, in the budget session, it even went through another revision. On the Friday before Memorial Day, the latest version of the bill was introduced, which is very specific about the opt-out provisions. It created the expungement provisions, which were, it's a little bit tricky. I don't want to get into the legalese, but technically New York didn't have expungement. So this law, this new revised law creates an expungement process where anyone who was previously arrested or convicted for something that will now be legal will have their records expunged, and people will be released from jail. So much detail has gone into this drug, including people have asked about whether there's anything about sustainability in the law, and there is language about trying to grow a sustainable product. So there has been so much that will be so much better if we can legalize it, regulate it, and have a safe product. Because if there is a demand, there will be a supply. So the supply is out there. Let's make it a safe supply.
So the biggest issue that I've had with decriminalization is that, for the most part, decriminalization has been used as a tool, a weapon, to deny people opportunities. Because that's essentially the impact of these low-level offenses. Even if they don't result in a criminal conviction, you lose a lot of opportunity. And that's really what's happened to members of minority communities, communities of color. Whereas with respect to legalization, first and foremost, all of those people, even if they were charged with a low-level misdemeanor, just as a practical matter, I'll give you an example as to how nuanced the difference is. If you have a small amount of marijuana in your pocket, just a very small amount, that can be charged as a violation, not a crime. But if that that little small amount is in public, now it's a misdemeanor, something that is a criminal charge. And interestingly enough, let's look at some of the mechanisms. And from the purposes of law enforcement, and I think David will agree with me on this, if you are a police officer, we see this on TV all the time, how many arrests have you made, right? They always talk about how many arrests that they've made, not talking about whether they're good arrests, not talking about whether or not those arrests resulted in a conviction, criminal or otherwise, but that's part of it. That's how decriminalization has been used as a tool versus legalization. Well, that's what will allow many people to get those opportunities back. Whether it means staving off these collateral consequences on housing, on education, on immigration. That's what this legislation has the ability to do. And that's really the definition of equity. Because even the stats that I announced earlier, what is very clear is that it is still having a disproportionate impact on communities of color. And that's not even speaking to all of the other things that have been brought up by everyone here, talking about regulation means that you may have a safer marijuana for use. Regulation means that there are benefits to state government taxation and just smaller businesses. I mean, as Nelson was talking, I was actually thinking, maybe I might want to invest in like a nice diner built across the street from a dispensary. I was actually thinking of opening up a Halal Guys franchise next to but that's a whole separate conversation. But these are the things that have always bothered me, because the amount of times, even representing a young person charged with this crime, or even just anyone charged with this crime, you're thinking what someone has to lose on either a low-level conviction or even no criminal conviction, it still boggles the mind. And it just really demonstrates exactly why decriminalization doesn't work.
So just to echo on a lot of the points that have already been stated, if decriminalization doesn't work, that's why we're here. We're here to create a regulated market to make things fair and safe for everyone. I can just show an example as Washington, D.C., which is decrim, but also allowed home grow, which allows adults over 21 to grow up to 6 plants in their home for personal possession. Well, what's that's created? It has created a gray market where people are gifting cannabis, and now there's a totally unregulated, untaxed market, which has created a ton of great entrepreneurs. I've visited DC many times, but these business owners, they want to be legal, they want to be regulated, they want to pay their taxes, they don't want to have multiple LLCs, S corps to try to just get by with their businesses. What we're trying to do here is change it and regulate it and create access. Because the reality is we have a medical program here, which is broken. Our New York State medical marijuana program really only benefits those that are privileged, because the reality is the program is too expensive. Getting a medical card is very expensive. There's limited conditions to get you one, even though it's simple to get it through telemedicine. When you go to one of these dispensaries, if you're a patient that needs tinctures or vaporizers, tinctures start anywhere between $75 and up for 1 milliliter of tincture. So, for example, my grandfather, he takes about an ounce a month. So if you do the math, it's extremely expensive for patients. And what this regulated market will do, will make sure those prices drop down, to create larger access, to create these entrepreneurial opportunities, and will ensure that the medicine, the products that are going out to the public, are safe and tested. That way you don't have to worry about pesticides and stuff. And one of the biggest things that we always hear right now with the current state of New York is these vape pens. They come with tainted all kinds of things. People are buying them illicitly. You have no idea what's in there. They have the little badges and stickers saying they're from California, but the reality is you really have no idea what you're consuming because it's an illicit product that you purchased. And we have people getting sick from it, and that's what we really have the opportunity to change. And the MRTA is probably the most progressive language that has gotten this far in the country. And like I stated before, New York City, whatever New York does, is going to dictate the rest of the country, and will dictate what happens internationally, because that's where we're headed next. And the reality is, the MRTA is the best way to get it right. Illinois, to date, Massachusetts, other states have recently legalized, have some very great progressive bills. But if we can get the MRTA through, I think we have a real opportunity here to give back to those that have been most affected and really create some positive change here in New York and the rest of the country.
Thank you so much. And just for folks who might not know what MRTA stands for, that is the Marijuana Regulation and Taxation Act. That is the bill that was sponsored by Assemblywoman Peoples-Stokes, as well as State Senator Krueger, and there is information in the back if anyone wants to read a little bit more about that. Okay, great. Now this is a question more for Mr. Jones, but please anyone feel free to jump in on this. How do you look at this issue from a law enforcement perspective?
Well, you can look at it from traditional law enforcement, which I've seen a couple of unions having press conferences and being against the legalization of marijuana. But from a black law enforcement perspective, as I said earlier, we have always supported the legalization of marijuana because we also understand that is a tool of oppression. It has always been a tool of oppression. If you look at the stats of arrest and who is being arrested, so it's another example of a tool of oppression. But then if you look at the police system, it's also a tool of getting overtime. It's also a tool of those that are in there to create arrest stats, right? Just like you said, you're just creating arrest stats. And all that's doing is fooling the people that you're actually fighting crime, right? So you have all these arrest stats of a bag of marijuana, right? You're messing up a young man's life, but you're creating stats saying that you're fighting crime, which is a fallacy, and a lot of the taxpayers don't understand that. They don't know. So when you look at these stats and they're making bogus stats on a small amount of marijuana, which they're really not doing anything but harming young people's lives. But if you go into the rich white communities, they do not over-police like they over-police in black communities. They do not do that, right? You don't see those same amount. And you figure rich white communities, they will have more drugs because they can afford it.
Exactly.
I mean, that's what it is. That's being honest. So, from a law enforcement perspective, it's a farce. So when you see law enforcement standing up there talking about, legalizing, we're talking about small amounts. We're not talking about truckloads of marijuana. We're not talking about that. We're talking about small amount of marijuana, and they're arguing to arrest more young people. That's what they're arguing for. And basically arrest more black people because they're not doing it in the white community. So, when you see that, really sit back and think about, what are they really talking about? And then when you look at the stats, they're talking about we want to keep arresting black people.
Yeah.
And that's what it's about.
I'll just add to that is that, law enforcement is not unanimous in opposition to this bill. Our organization works with a group called Law Enforcement Against Prohibition, Law Enforcement Action Partnership. Over 300 police officers. We just had the White Plains Tuesday Chief Peter Volkman from Chatham upstate in Columbia County, who published an op-ed in the Albany Times-Union a couple months ago, firmly in favor of marijuana regulation. And a lot of forward-thinking police officers understand this. Look, there's a role for law enforcement. It shouldn't be for arresting young people of color for smoking a joint.
Just to add to that, it's not just people of color, because this has been a means to, I think, really ravage socioeconomically depressed communities as well. And that's a very important point to acknowledge. Because think about where, if you're talking about the 19 white people that were arrested, I suspect that those arrests weren't taking place in Bedford.
Exactly.
just a hunch.
Exactly.
And as a practical matter, much of this type of enforcement, not just in New York State, nationally, it's about a systematic war and ravaging communities of color and poor people, because those are communities that are always over-policed. So you have to take that into account. I think just also from a law enforcement perspective, and typically, I've always been on the opposite side arguing, cross-examining the police officer. But I think Damon very astutely characterized it. It is, people are assessed on data, right? And what do we know about data? They're numbers. And like anything else, numbers can be manipulated. And the most critical question to ask whenever you see numbers is where were they generated, and what do they actually mean? And that's been part of the problem, is that at least with this issue, and really with many issues that we're dealing with in the criminal justice system, people are just presented with numbers and they don't question them. So the idea that this will be a gateway, that this will lead to, a pandemic of drug use, that is, I mean to say it's a fallacy, it's an understatement. And while I appreciate that people have some concerns, and it's certainly, it is certainly not unreasonable to have concerns, you have to acknowledge first and foremost what the system is right now does not work.
I just want to add a one-liner, that the problems with drug use are a public health issue,
Yes.
not a criminal justice issue.
Yes,
Exactly right.
Thank you. Now, how do you look at this issue, or I'm sorry, how does, and this is more of a question for Ms. Tane, how does your perspective or your experience as a parent or working with families influence your perspective?
Well, I alluded to earlier that, I've seen where the issues are with families that are in need or at risk, and students that have social, emotional needs and mental health issues. And the areas and funding for those issues are so scarce, and we have to fight so hard to get programming for those kinds of programs, that I can see that is where the resources really need to go. And one of the things that the MRTA will do is direct funding towards the schools. About 25% will, 25% will go towards the state education department, for funding, towards funding schools. So it's again, that the funding stream and addressing issues at the front end, and having the funds for the social, emotional, and mental health needs of individuals that have problematic drug use. Putting them in jail is not going to solve their problems. They need access to support and mental health services. So, and just as a parent, I can see that my children have access, and it's easy to get. And I would like that the education that goes towards our students to be reality-based, and I'd like to have an honest conversation with our youth, and I think that will delay use, and if for those who do use, will have access to safe product.
I would just add that from our perspective, prohibition tears the families apart. One thing Son and I were talking about on the way here is the whole impact of the child welfare system. And I could tell you, I heard a horror story at one of the hearings about a woman who was having a terrible time holding on to her pregnancy. Someone suggested to her that she could use some marijuana to help her weight gain, and it worked, and she had a healthy baby, but they urine-toxed her baby at birth, and of course, baby had some metabolites of marijuana. Now she's gone through living hell in the child welfare system. They won't let the child's father see the baby. She's got to go constantly for counseling and all sorts of things, all because she tried to make sure her baby was born and healthy. And we see the cases over and over and over again like this. Look, there's a real important role for the child welfare system. There are kids who are being injured and killed. There's no question. But so much of their time and effort is spent persecuting people for low-level issues around marijuana use, that it's not a good use of our taxpayers' money, and it certainly doesn't promote healthy families.
And I just want to add one thing to that. Through our membership base, we've heard horror stories from families out west as far as immigration goes, as small cannabis offense, whether it be a child or a parent getting caught up with cannabis, being undocumented, and then that leading to their deportation. It's the number 4 reason folks are getting deported right now for being undocumented. We all know how immigration is working right now, and this is, as far as family separation goes, a little bit of cannabis shouldn't be the reason why these families are being separated, especially, CPS shouldn't get involved when it comes to folks that are using this medicinally or anything like that. Just one last thing I want to add.
Thank you. Now for Mr. Rabinowitz, as an addiction treatments professional, what would marijuana regulation mean for public health, including youth use and addiction?
Sure. Well, again, none of us want to see young people having access to cannabis. We know that, as the Drug Policy Alliance's curriculum talks about, there are risks to the developing adolescent brain for early marijuana use, particularly regular early marijuana. Occasional, probably not so much, but certainly regular marijuana use is problematic for kids. But, things don't change in terms of the prevention message that's out there. We want to do good. There is good science-based prevention out there. None of it has to. We look at things like risk and protective factors, what the children at risk for later problems with substance use, what kind of things protect them. And I'll go back to my earlier point, is that one of the things we know is the biggest risk factor for young people is what we call adverse childhood experiences, basically trauma. It not only affects later substance use disorders, mental health, there's even a lot of studies that show physical health issues that come from having childhood trauma and adverse experiences. So let's focus our time and effort on dealing with those issues, making sure those kids are healthy, and be able to have an honest and open conversation about marijuana use instead of trying to shove it into the closet, just using the old "just say no" message, which well, your brain is your brain on drugs, or all of that stuff. Look, I have some DVDs of all those films that were back in the 30s, like Reefer Madness and Marijuana, Assassin of Youth, and all that sort of thing. It didn't work then, and those kind of scare tactics and mythologies don't work now. Kids see right through them, and in fact, if anything, when you try to push too hard against it, if anything, it pushes them in the other direction. So let's be honest and open about it, have a candid conversation, just say, look, cannabis use should be an adult choice. It is better for you if you wait until you're an adult to decide whether or not you want to use marijuana the same way as with alcohol.
To add to that, so when you look at it from a criminal justice perspective with respect to addiction, and like anything else, the criminal justice system is slow to catch up. And it was only in 2009, 2010 where we were able to reform the drug laws in New York State. But when you look at how they even address addiction, and it's funny, I had a judge say this very astutely. So when you look at crimes involving possession of a controlled substance and marijuana, these are crimes of compulsion, right? Because that's what addiction is, it's a compulsion. And when you're actually addressing the science of it and with the types of changes that you're talking about, as it stands right now with the way criminalization has worked, it's put people on a very long and drawn-out process through the criminal justice system, sometimes needlessly, unfairly. And that's one of the things that the change, this bill, just legalization is going to help resolve. That's just one point to take into consideration as to what is the driving force even behind someone getting caught up in the criminal justice system with respect to these kinds of charges.
Yeah. So from an industry regulation and business licensing standpoint, what do we need to keep in mind regarding marijuana regulation legalization?
So when it comes to industry and legalization, it comes down to the equity component and making sure that it's not just big industry, these big interest groups that are having access to these licenses. Like we've seen in Massachusetts and California with Prop 64, there have been equity licenses given, so it's priority for minority-owned, women-owned, veteran-owned companies, and that's something that the MRTA does very well and hopefully, you know, in the very near future will come into play, because that's what's going to help allow folks to have access and ownership in this industry. You know, right now, if you want one of these dispensary licenses, we're talking upwards of like 3 to 5 million minimum. In New Jersey, which just in the last round, which was just medical expansion, vertically integrated, which means they have access to the dispensary, manufacturing, and cultivation. A license like that, more or less, is going to cost you about $20 to $30 million. So unless you have, you know, that just laying around in your bank, you have to be able to show that liquid before doing an application. So for most folks to have access to even put one of these applications together, it goes right to the bottom of the pile if they don't have access to that institutional or that type of capital. And that's, you know, what the MRTA is solving, and what we've seen in other progressive bills to solve is creating these micro licenses to allow these micro industries to survive, to do well. Because the reality is, big cannabis is going to come in, it's going to help destigmatize it, and we need that big push to come in so normal folks can see it. But with that, we have to create the framework and licenses and small businesses to allow other folks to have, you know, a seat at the table. The beauty of this cannabis industry that's coming in, it's a multi-billion-dollar industry, it'll be a trillion-dollar industry when it goes international. You know, this is the type of industry that helps create generational wealth. This is .com boom. And our big focus has been about educating people of color about that, you know, the Latinx community, the African American community. Because we miss the .com boom, but we can't miss our opportunity right now with the green rush. And it's about getting educated, it's about knowing. And as long as we have progressive bills that have good licensing programs, we're going to see that next round of entrepreneurs be successful in this.
Right.
Did anyone else want to comment on that? Thank you. So this is actually a number of these, I've gotten some index card questions back, and a number of them actually are regarding this very question. How would DUI enforcement work under regulation?
I can take that. Okay. So a lot of our people that are against marijuana legalization cite this as a primary problem. And I think the first thing that we say in answer to that is we already have DUI laws, and we already have people using, and we already have a system in place to make drivers responsible if they are driving under the influence. So it is true that the current testing for THC is not an accurate reflection of whether you're impaired because it stays in your system for so long. But Steve's going to mention something about that. I'll let him add that part. But that is the most important thing to remember, that we already have a system in place. The other thing is that there is training that can be done for what's called drug recognition experts. And there is money in the bill up front to go towards training of officers to have specific knowledge of what the legal test would be if they stop a driver who's impaired by marijuana. But I think, again, and then the other thing that's really important to remember is that the responsible data shows that the rate of driving under the influence did not increase in states where it's legal. There are some facts that people will say is contrary, but if you look at the numbers carefully, you will see that, again, because THC stays in your system for so long, that data can easily be skewed. But the real data shows, legal experts from Colorado, other states where it's legal, it has not increased. And we already have a system in place. And that would be officers, and where were officers 5 years ago saying, oh, we have a problem with people who are impaired. Why is that all of a sudden a problem? Ask ourselves, right? So let's see that was about testing.
Right, well, first of all, I'd say that Lisa's 100% right. I was a teenager a long time ago, and I can tell you I was in more than a few cars. I didn't drive at the time. More than a few cars with people who were impaired, and why I'm still alive, I don't know. Maybe God takes pity on fools or whatever. But, you know, the saying is that there is technology. One of the problems, of course, with marijuana is that the active component, THC, tetrahydrocannabinol, if that interests anybody, stays in your system. It's fat soluble, stays in your system sometimes as long as 30 days afterwards. You can't simply test for THC. But there's new technology coming out with breathalyzers. One particular I just saw recently is something that tests for a specific component, which is delta 5 THC, if I'm getting it right. And that's the intoxicating component, which this new breathalyzer can detect for like 8 hours of use, which is where you're much more likely to be intoxicated, and that combined with field testing, at least referred to, makes it for more effective. Look, when there's demand, the technology will fix it. As more and more states come to regulate marijuana, there's demand for this technology. Canada's been working on it, and let's face it, there's some 21-year-old kid out there who's going to figure it out and come up with something very soon. Look, the British National Health Service came up with a device, like claims, that you plug into your cell phone that can detect an STD in urine sample. Now, you don't dip in your phone or anything. But, so they come up with that technology. There are now condoms that detect STDs. And it's an odd thought, but we won't go there. But there is technology coming up. People are looking to address this, and that combined with using standards for drug recognition enforcement, this issue can be addressed.
Thank you. So how do we implement legalization in a way that works to redress the harms done? I know there were, I think this has been touched upon during various questions, but if anyone wants to expand.
I can add that there is in the bill a clear distribution of the money and where it's going to go. And as I mentioned earlier, 25%. I mean, they're estimating, they have a rough estimate. I hesitate to give a number because, we really don't know, but they're estimating a very low number of 300 million. And they're saying 25%, 65 million will go to education funding, 25%, another 65 million to drug treatment and public education, and 50% will go to the establishment of community grant reinvestment fund, which will direct resources to programming that serves communities that were disproportionately impacted by the war on drugs in the form of youth development, job training, placement, reentry services, adult education program, and other services that are responsive to community needs. So spelled out in the legislation is specific funding to communities that were harmed, in addition to all of the equity provisions in the licensing that is already spoken about.
And I'll just add expungement to that. That actually has to be a critical component of it because there's so many people that, independent of whether or not they spend a day in jail, they certainly have the stigma of a conviction.
Right.
And, just in general, having a criminal conviction can be a prohibition. It can be a barrier to so much. There has to be, and the bill does provide for that, a mechanism for expungement.
And just to add on top of that, as far as the private sector goes, I've had the opportunity to consult for some of these multi-state operators, which means they have licenses for cultivation dispensaries in different states. Companies like Cresco Labs, as well as Acreage and Iantis, are starting to develop programs that are specifically around corporate social responsibility, which is about creating educational programs, reinvestment programs. So if and when the government or whatever bill passes doesn't do right by the people, at least we're starting to see these big multinational corporations starting to take the right steps forward to giving back to these communities, educating these communities, helping in the licensing portion of it to make sure that minority-owned brands, smaller brands have the opportunity of those like multi-state operators to be viable businesses. So we're seeing it on multiple fronts. So it's extremely important that we continue this and the education, the messaging is put forth in the right way.
Thank you. So last question before we jump into questions from the audience. What are some of the most common myths about regulation, and what should we understand about them? I know there's a lot.
So one of the ones I've heard is just, this is going to lead to widespread abuse. And, everyone's going to be smoking pot, and it's just chaos everywhere. I'll just say this. even prescription legal drugs are subject to abuse. And certainly we're aware of that, whether it's Oxycontin, the narcotics, everything. I mean, we recently, I think just in the last year, they were talking about a massive indictment by the U.S. Attorney's Office locally that caught up several doctors and pharmacists on just widespread prescription narcotic distribution. And again, these are quote-unquote legal drugs. And that's the stuff they're focusing on. And think about who the communities that are actually using those drugs and are abusing those drugs, because you're not seeing those prescriptions dispensed, necessarily in Mount Vernon.
Exactly.
If we're looking at this county as an example, I would suspect it would be more the northern affluent part. From a different perspective, look, the heroin epidemic didn't really become an epidemic until certain communities really started experiencing it. Right? When you started seeing the fatalities, I'll say this from a matter of perspective. In the early 90s, when people were talking about heroin and people using it, they were talking about issues in southern Westchester. No one seemed to care. But when the fatalities happened in Harrison, Pleasantville, exactly, or how about this? Our president has described it as, this massive public health issue, but how do you compare that to people who abuse crack cocaine?
Right.
Absolutely. And think about how, again, it's been used as a tool. So I think with respect to it, these are the things that you have to be mindful of when you're talking about, looking at enforcement, how it's been used. The history of this is problematic. And for those that are expressing these concerns and reservations, anecdotally, I'll say this. The amount of times when I've conferenced a case, let's say in the northern part of the county, and I've heard someone say, but you're going to destroy this kid's life, it's just pot. And I'm going, okay, versus, having that conversation in jurisdictions in the southern part of the county. It's ridiculous.
Exactly.
This person has to do community service, and you're just talking about the disproportionate enforcement, that I've seen. It is a problem, and to make sure that it's applied evenly in the concerns that people have, a lot of that is actually built into the proposed legislation.
I would add, at the risk of talking about decrim, too much, I just want to say that the biggest myth that I encounter is that we should decriminalize, is what people say. And I say, we did decriminalize in 1977. It's been on the books since 1977. So that is the most important thing to tell people. And we still, in a 20-year period, have 800,000 arrests, statewide, for example, and all of the other things. And another thing that we didn't touch on that decrim is a problem is it's a parole violation also, which affects people. And because even if you are given the violation and it's a fine, if people can't afford the fine, then they're later arrested and the warrant is out for them for not paying the fine. So it is such a problem, and so that's my main thing. People say, we should decriminalize. We did decriminalize. So I just want to make sure that that is really clear, and that youth use is going to explode. And if they don't think youth use has already exploded, I don't know where they live.
I just have to add one thing is that the substances that injure and kill and destroy more lives and cost society more money are alcohol and tobacco, two legal substances. Do much more damage and are far more toxic than marijuana is or ever will be, as strong as people claim it is today. We look at the issue, the concerns about it, and say, well, if we're really concerned about, damage and cost to society, well, two of the biggest things that cost society these days, in terms of healthcare costs, are diabetes and coronary artery disease. Well, if that's the case, we should put a cop at the Dunkin' Donut shop and check people's blood sugar and hypertension, and lock them up if they try to buy munchies. Let's look at this from that. Let's keep a balanced perspective on it. One of the other things I'll listen to. So Assad touched on prescription drugs, and I need to get this out there. Who helps fund a lot of the opposition to marijuana legalization or regulation? Anyway, Insys Pharmaceuticals, manufacturer of prescription fentanyl. Executives convicted of racketeering, $500,000 contribution to opposition to marijuana. Sheldon Adelson, I won't even get into his politics, but whose wife owns for-profit methadone clinics. And nothing wrong with methadone clinics, they're a good thing. But interesting, he's contributing. The folks like from behind substance abuse, quote-unquote smart approaches to marijuana. Lots of money coming from big pharma. So you have to ask the question, why is that? And I leave you to draw your own conclusions, but it raises a lot of concern about why this whole issue about decriminalization versus legalization.
And not to forget, the big beer companies, Anheuser-Busch donated thousands, millions upon dollars throughout the country in different legalization initiatives. I guess one of the big myths is, big tobacco's going to come in and run this whole thing. And the only way that really happens is if we let them happen.
Exactly.
We have great bills like MRTA. We have bills like what just got passed in Illinois and Massachusetts. And if those are the type of legislation language that gets passed, we're not going to have that issue. We're going to have a clean industry that folks can look up to. Because right now, the way it looks, black and brown folks would make up the prison industry, but not the legal industry. And that's what has to change at the end of the day. We got to make sure we free the plant, free the people.
All right.
All right, so we're going to jump into questions from the audience. First question, in terms of money, what about gentrification in communities that were once affected by the drug epidemic?
I feel like we kind of already answered that one. The 50% is going to reinvestment.
Right, but I also think that we should definitely focus on those communities, especially in economic development and job growth and small business. They should be the communities targeted first, to put these factories, to put the growth plants, or I don't even know what they call them, but what do they call them?
Cultivation facilities.
There you go. Poor communities throughout New York State, they should be targeted for that. They should be targeted to put these factories in there. Because those are the communities that have been affected from this false drug war from the beginning. So, for us to say that we're going to take these centers and put them in communities that already have job growth is redundant. We should put it in Mount Vernon, Yonkers, Portchester. All those areas should have those, and make sure that they hire from the community that the business is in. And that's how we create economic development from this legislation, because we're actually employing families that have been suffering from this war on drugs for the last 30 to 50 years.
I think one more answer to that question is there's a wonderful editorial by a Denver attorney who had on May 31st, had a Times Union had an op-ed about the experience in Colorado, and I think that these numbers are really illustrative of what we could look forward to if we have legalization. Since going into effect, legal adult use cannabis has led to massive economic growth. Approximately 23,600 Coloradans are directly employed in the industry. When ancillary jobs are added, the figure rises to nearly 10,000 more jobs statewide. Nor are these menial jobs, but good jobs providing good wages, with openings at all levels of experience. 2018 marijuana sales totaled $1.63 billion, which doesn't account for the full economic impact. Further, the open licensing system has allowed a mix of small and large businesses to flourish and ensure a competitive marketplace. Legislation has produced nearly $1 billion in tax revenue since 2014, going to an annual total of $266 million in 2018 alone. And by enacting regulatory controls on adult use cannabis, New York policymakers can generate funding for schools, infrastructure, recreation, in addition to providing support for communities that have been disproportionately harmed by decades of prohibition and the failed war on drugs. So those are some real numbers of what we can look forward to.
And in Colorado, any business, generally food related, within 1 to 2 mile radius of dispensaries has seen anywhere between a 10 to 15% growth in sales since legalization. So it's, like in the gold rush, the folks that did had the picks and the shovels selling those on the ancillary side made just as much money, if not more, than those are actually finding gold. But the only way that these communities have an opportunity to have access to this is to be educated and to have the right know-how to set up these legal entities so that way they can benefit from this future industry that's going to be coming to our state.
Okay, and so and it's good segue into this other question, although I think we touched on this, maybe if we could just expand on it. What would that process look like? The portion of the revenue generated going to the communities that were hardest hit. Could someone speak on what that process could possibly look like? I know we heard a little bit about the percentage that would go to communities, but what could that look like if a community that was deeply affected by the war on drugs, how would they attain this money, or how do you prioritize what communities get what?
So, I mean, when it comes to that, and the MRTA bill, if I'm not mistaken, takes a big portion of that tax revenue and invests it directly into these communities for some of these educational programs. And as far as licensing goes, minority, women-owned licenses from these affected areas tend to have more of a first of the line, get to the front of the line as far as winning these licenses, mostly on the dispensary side, because as far as cultivation goes, that's usually going to be upstate New York. Just bigger room for bigger factories, and the same thing with manufacturing. But when it comes to creating those opportunities, it's about investing in the educational and these incubator type programs that we're starting to see, whether it be on the nonprofit sector, on the private sector, to educate these communities to actually go ahead and be able to have the capital necessary to obtain one of these micro licenses or these smaller licenses that are mentioned in the MRTA.
I would just add that if and when hopefully this bill passes, there will then be a period of drafting of regulations which have not been drafted yet, which will go into some of the more specifics of how this will be allocated. So not all of that has already been done, but as I mentioned earlier, there has been a tremendous amount of work that has gone into crafting the bill and thinking about all of these issues. And a lot of active politicians who have been very careful to make sure that the right provisions will be there to make the stream of money go where it's supposed to go.
California is a great example of that. If you look at what Oakland has done with the Hood Incubator, really empowering, educating these communities to actually have an opportunity to go after these licenses. And now what we're seeing go on in LA and Massachusetts and Boston with the next 20 licenses only going to minority-owned. And especially with the liquor licenses as well. Same thing, there's an exclusivity for the next round of licensing for people of color and those who have been formerly incarcerated.
My village has an anti-drug school group called Croton Coalition. They focus disproportionately on marijuana, specifically advocating that it should not be legalized. How can we challenge the focus or existence of these groups? This one is grant funded, but is fully embraced by the school system.
The first thing I'd say, if they're grant funded, I might remind people that there's this thing called the Hatch Act. It's a federal law that says people are not supposed to be using federal funds for the purpose of lobbying or promoting legislation. So I might raise that question right off the bat, is who's paying for all this stuff? The more important thing, though, aside from that, is to remember that, look, there's nothing in prevention science or, again, things I talked about, the standard risk and protection factors, that talks about marijuana prohibition. That is not the issue with doing good prevention. We do not need any more than alcohol prohibition, because that's part of prevention too. We don't want young people misusing or overusing or even indulging in alcohol before they're 21. So if we're able to do that with a legal substance, alcohol is a legal substance, there's no reason that we cannot do good prevention. And again, I would tell people who are doing prevention work, you know what, focus again on issues of childhood trauma, the issues that put people at risk. That's real prevention. Stop playing politics. It's not good for the people you're serving, and it's not good for anybody.
I would add that I would invite myself to that group and try to educate them. I think that when I attended a lobby day for Mother's Day, we did a mom's lobby day. One of the women that I was lobbying with was someone who's very active in Queens and her parent council. And she said when she first came to this space, she was like, oh no, no drug legalization. And then she learned the facts. And once she learned the facts, she realized how how ludicrous the war on drugs is, how much it doesn't work, what the science is, what the facts are, and what all the positives are of regulation. People are scared, they're knee-jerk, that, oh my God, drugs bad, can't have them. But when you learn the facts, so I would encourage you to invite any of us to come and speak to that group. I know people from the Drug Policy Alliance are always willing to come and speak to groups like that. So really maybe have some really deep conversations and ask them questions about what race their children are and if they're concerned about the children who are affected by this being illegal. And those are the kids that I'm worried about.
And I'll just say one thing, someone said this very well. I don't need somebody else's child to be arrested so my child learns lessons about drugs. And that's an important thing to remind everybody.
And I just
Better said.
I just want to add one thing on top of that. This group should probably have a sit down with some of the high school students that are in their district, that go to that district, because the reality is, as someone who grew up in northern Westchester, who had two brothers go through the Westchester County School District and friends all over the district, the reality is we can get access to any harder drug, not just cannabis. It's available everywhere. And that's the real issue. You know, it's easier to get pills, heroin right now than it is to get alcohol.
Yeah.
So it's at the end of the day, unless they're having those conversations with the people that they're supposed to be trying to protect, these high school students, they're not doing their job, and we need to change that.
And I would like to add, kids that I see, even you know, I don't know how they get it in jail, but they get it. They ain't smoking weed; they smoking cake too. So they're not. So they're not even smoking the average, you know, marijuana. They're smoking all this chemical lace, whatever it is, but they're not even touching that. So we're creating a narrative that these kids are smoking marijuana, but they're not. They're not even smoking anything close to what we call marijuana. So, you know, we really have to have more communication with our children to find out what they're actually using, because we think that they're using marijuana, they're not. They're not.
But just to even add to that, I would argue that legalization actually will be more beneficial with respect to prevention.
Right.
Okay, alcohol is legal. Think about how many preventative programs they have to curb underage drinking, because you can have honest conversations about it. A lot of resources are dedicated to it. So the purpose of, you look at legalization of marijuana, no one's saying, hey, we want 16-year-olds to start smoking pot. The idea then is to actually have very targeted programs to ensure that there is not underage usage of marijuana. That's the whole purpose of it. The purpose of the regulation is to actually better educate and also have better treatment programs to deal with these type of issues. In fact, it would actually curb substance abuse.
Thank you. Now, what is being done right now to educate our local law enforcement and legal representatives with marijuana decriminalization statistics? What are our local arrest statistics? That might be more of a technical, that would be a little harder to answer.
What was that last thing you said?
What are our local arrest statistics? I think we probably have statistics for Westchester, but not for Peekskill. Are meetings and forums being held with high attendance, participation of local law enforcement and legal representatives speaking on where they stand on this issue?
Good question. Because, you know, a lot of times it's hard to get law enforcement to sit with the community that they actually serve and discuss racial bias policies that they use. We had NAACP had a meeting in White Plains, and the mayor and the police chief sat up there and denied, said racism doesn't exist in the police department. So if they would say that, you know, they will skew it. But I think it's more so up to the public to understand how data is used and how data is skewed and how they use the data to support their agenda. And I think that it's up to the community to have forums with their chief and with their mayor and actually discuss policies and procedures and how it affects their community. I want to say that, you know, when you hear community policing is not what the commissioner or the mayor is telling the community on how they're going to police the community. It's the community demanding the mayor and the commissioner on how they want their community policed. So we need to understand that the power is with the people. That is true community policing. So if you see policies that from your police department that you do not like, it's up to the people to demand change. You know, usually in Westchester and most municipalities, the police commissioner works at the will of the mayor. And that the police commissioner is not addressing racial justice through policies and procedures in his police department, then, and if the mayor does not want to direct him to do so, then you get a new mayor. You know, it is up to the people to also understand the political process, how the political process works through law enforcement. So I do think that more communities should have forums and have their commissioners come out, have their chiefs come out, have their head of the detective bureau come out, have some of the detectives come out and talk about their policies and how their policies affect their community.
I'd like to add that there are a number of groups, including the Drug Policy Alliance and Steve's group, which I'm going to mess up if I say the name.
Families for Sensible Drug Policy.
Thank you, and the coalition of a whole bunch of agencies, Stark, Smart, New York, that have been heavily lobbying, to use a dirty word, have been heavily talked.
We don't get federal grants.
We have been talking to our elected officials constantly and trying to give them all of the information and provide the facts. And so what I really want to say is what will influence them the most are phone calls from you. And I see a lot of agreement in this audience. So if you are pro-legalization and you see all the benefits, I urge you to call your local assembly person and senator. They are absolutely affected by these phone calls. Don't feel like you're wasting your time. And if you need any help figuring out who those people are, and call the governor as well. So your state assembly person, your state senator, and the governor make the 3 phone calls. It takes about a minute a phone call. Just say, I'm calling in support of the MRTA. That's all you have to say. So please make those calls.
And I just want to give a special shout out to Catherine from Drug Policy Alliance, who's here, who's been, I don't know if she eats and sleeps lately, because she's been working, I don't know how many hours a day and night on, keeping the momentum going in terms of our again, I can say lobby because we don't get any federal money. Our lobbying for the bill and public education. So what's the website again? I don't remember it. No, the Start Smart.
Oh,
Start Smart New York, and it'll come up.
Yeah.
Start Smart New York.
Right.
Start Smart.
And you'll get all the
find me
information.
afterwards too, and I can get you information. And we have a lobby day on Wednesday, free busing.
And if anyone wants to host a forum or wants to have folks come in to have these, even just take a pitch about this, please talk to Catherine after the forum ends, or talk to any of us here. I'm sure folks are willing to come to speak at your meetings, your committee meetings, whatever the case may be, to further dispel the myths that have been spread about marijuana regulation. So a lot of the questions that were also asked from the audience, I think we've already touched on, and we are running out of time, so I appreciate everyone's patience with us. I do want to go ahead and close up, and I want to allow our panelists to have, we'll just keep it to about 2 minutes each, closing remarks. And if you can center your remarks around what is at stake if we do not pass regulations.
I'd like to thank everybody. I think this was a great conversation. What is at stake is the future of our communities. I think that this legislation is very important to move forward on social justice initiative and to address past wrongs. Like it was said before, I think it's up to the people to call our elected officials, to call our governor, to call the head of the assembly, to call the head of the Senate, and tell them that this piece of legislation should be passed. And also look for, as I always say, the need to change our communities, the communities that have been affected by this false war on drugs for decades. And I think it's time for us to right that wrong.
Yeah, I agree 100%. I think that every day we defer on this action, there's another individual, another family that is seriously hurt, in many cases maybe irreparably, by the damage of that prohibition does. Look, regulated marijuana is not going to cure all the risks and issues around, overuse or misuse of cannabis, but again, it opens us up to the possibility of having honest conversation with real science-based prevention education for people under 21 about marijuana, and have a healthy and honest conversation with society in general. Look, it's our hope that moving in that direction, we can focus on the things that we really need to focus on, that will address the problem of substance use disorders in society, the economic, social, racial, and familial problems that cause that, and what a society would look like that really addresses that, focuses efforts on addressing those issues rather than on trying to punish people for their use of marijuana. So again, thank you everybody for being part of this conversation. My fellow panelists, I think we had a great discussion today.
I also want to thank everybody for coming out and listening. I want to just takeaways are, it is a marijuana drug use is a public health issue. It is not a criminal justice issue. The benefits of legalizing so far outweigh any possible negatives. I mean, we could go on and on about all the positives that can come as a result of legalizing and minimizing the harm that's done every day. There's an average of 60 arrests, marijuana arrests a day. And to leave you, it's not going to cure all institutional racism, but it's certainly going to make a dent. And finally, I leave you with my call to action. Please make those phone calls. I swear to you they matter. And get everyone you know, send out a mass email to anyone you think is sympathetic to make the calls as well.
I mean, at this point, I think I'm going to sound like a broken record. But first off, thank everyone for coming, and thank everyone for coming, and certainly I thank all my fellow panelists for this discussion. But as a practical matter, just even starting with the issue of institutional racism, this will absolutely do a lot to curb where we're at with it. This is an absolute public health issue, and just speaking from experience, this has no business being in the realm of criminal justice. It never did, and it now needs to have a pathway to exit being in that realm, and this is what legalization will do. And, just from a personal perspective, like anything else, there is a degree of, for all the people that are naysayers about legalization, look, you still have the ability, if you're a parent, to raise your children not to do this. This is, to a certain extent, also playing into the aspect of personal choice and your own individual values. The idea that someone would say, hey, if it's legalized, like I said earlier, I'm not going to be someone that is going to go celebrate with a bonfire per se, because it's a matter of personal choice. But nonetheless, the benefits far outweigh the cons, and I've just seen too much damage done to people because of this.
Well, I guess the last one to go. Thank you, NAACP, for having this. Thank you, Peekskill Library. I'm very happy to be here in my home county, being able to talk about this issue. And thank you, panelists and Vanessa, for setting this up. I just leave you with a couple things, just to echo some of the points from before. Make these phone calls. What's at stake right now is us being the example for the rest of the country. Great bills have passed before, but MRTA, if it is to pass or when it is to pass, is going to be the staple that other states will be able to look at and introduce. And it's the bill that has the most equity expungement language in there that we need to follow through. Because the last thing we want to do here in the state of New York is to allow federal legalization to come first, and then we just allow big tobacco and all the administration's friends to take over. And then we're going to be fighting a real uphill battle to try to make New York equitable and make sure that folks who need this opportunity, who deserve this opportunity, actually have one. So thank you all again for showing up and having this discussion with us. This has been a great day, and I hope that in a couple weeks' time we'll have the MRTA pass and we'll be starting to talk about let's get regulations done. Because Amsterdam says they're the best social use place in the world. Wait till New York gets social use. I'm sure.
So thank thank you all again so much for coming. I do want to point out that we did invite our Assemblywoman Sandy Galef as well as State Senator Pete Harcum, who are the representatives for this area in Peekskill. So if you live in Peekskill, those are the folks you should be reaching out to. We're very thankful that although State Senator Pete Harcum did want to be here, he wasn't able to. He had something else he had to do last minute, but he did bring a representative if he wanted to sway. Feel free to talk to him after this forum ends and tell him how much you want the MRTA to pass. Just to reiterate how important it is to make those phone calls. I mean, if we're going to really see this move, please, please, please call your representatives. We have about, 8 or 7 session days left.
June 19th.
Literally, that is all we have left to pass any legislation this year. After that, we have to wait until January, and we know that that's an election year for all of our state representatives. So we don't know if this is going to be an issue that is being picked up. So the best thing we can do is to put all of our efforts to getting this passed this session. So if you live in Pete Harcum's district, I'm going to give everyone his number so you guys can make your phone calls on Monday. You can reach Pete Harcum's office in Peekskill at 914-241-4600. Is that the correct number?
Yes, and I also have cards.
Okay, good.
Great. And then for our Assemblywoman Sandy Galef, you can reach her at, and I do believe Pete Harcum has been more amicable about this, as much as one can be without co-sponsoring it, about this bill than Sandy has. So please give her a call especially. You can reach her. Her office number is 914-941-1111. And if for some reason you do not live in either of these districts, feel free to come see me afterwards or any of us afterwards. We'll make sure to point you in the right direction. Again, you want to say that you are in support of the Marijuana Regulation and Taxation Act. If you need more information about that, there are materials in the back. Thank you all so much for participating in this conversation. This is absolutely, just to reaffirm what everyone said, we need to make sure that we pass legislation that is centered around equity. And that is what MRTA truly is. I don't think we've seen as comprehensive of a piece of legislation for legalization anywhere in the nation. So this is big and we want to make sure that we legalize it right. So thank you all so much for coming. I hope you have a great day. I hope you had your questions answered and I hope you learned something new. Thank you much. Thank you so much.
Once again, coming as casual as I can. This has been a wonderful conversation. I thank all the panelists for coming. Without you, we would know a lot of what this means. So we're grateful to know about this information. We're thankful that you all came to participate in the conversation. How many learned more today?
Absolutely. Yeah.
I learned so much. Yes, and that's what the NAACP wants to do. We want to make sure we get the information out to our community because you need to know. We can't all go based on what we heard and what we think and what we feel. Okay? So take what you heard, go out, tell more people, tell people about the Peekskill NAACP and what we do. How many of you are members? Can you please stand up?
Sign up for membership.
Yes, and we had new members sign up today. We thank you all, because without you, we could not succeed. So there's a lot going on in June, okay? So we already did this forum, which, yay. June 13th, we have Natalie Wilson, who is the vice president of our branch, and she is doing a youth membership drive at the Youth Bureau on June 13th. 2 days before the parade, the big parade. What parade? Juneteenth. Juneteenth, yes. I'm glad you all know that. And then we have we have June 19th. Yes? Yes. Going to Albany. Yes? No?
Albany's on 13th.
Thank you, I know something, I knew it was in there. Okay, so y'all got that information. Please introduce yourselves to the panelists here. They have been phenomenal in getting this information. Phenomenal. We thank you. I know you guys may not have to go home, but you gotta get out of here. So thank you very much. Yes, take coffee and donuts and everything.